We continue now at the top of Daf Vavam Beis Mesechet Shekalim. This is Shekalim Daf 6b. The Mishnah says, Moser Shekalim Chulin. If you have the leftover, the extra money that was designated for Machatzis HaShekel, it is Chulin. This follows the position of Beis Hillel before, that if a person took a bunch of money and said it's for Machatzis HaShekel, the extra money, the money that is beyond the Machatzis HaShekel, is going to be Chulin. It's not going to have Kedusha. Moser Asiris Ha'efa, if you have the extra money, let's say a person designated for a carbon mincha, this will be explained in the Gemara. Moser Kinei Zavin, Kinei Zavos, V'Kinei Yoldos. Let's say you have extra from the nest, the birds that are brought for a zav or a zava or a yoledes, they bring these karbanos of birds, and you have extra money. Chatos v'ashamos, so let's say you have extra from a carbon chatos, from a carbon asham. Mosran nidava. In all of those cases, the extra is going to be nidava. What nidava means is that when in the summer days, when the days were long, they didn't want the mizbeach to be bottled. They didn't want there to be no karbanos at all in the mizbeach. So the nidava, this money would be used to put karbanos on the mizbeach at those times. Zehaklal, here's the rule: Kol shuba l'shem chatos umisham ashma. Anything that's a carbon chatos or something that's brought for some kind of guilt, for some kind of sin, mosra nedava. The extra money again is used for nedava for the mizbeach. Moser ola liola. Let's say a person designates money for carbon ola. He has extra money. He should use that for another carbon ola for himself. Similarly, moser mincha lemincha. Person has a carbon mincha that he designates money for, and he has extra money. He should use it for a carbon mincha for himself. Moser shlamim l'shlamim. Extra money for a shlamim should be used for a shlamim. Same idea. Moser hapesach l'shlamim. Also, if you have extra money for carbon pesach, you should use that for carbon shlamim as well. Moser nazirim l'nazirim. Now, this case is, let's say a person designated money for a carbon for a nazir, not for himself as a nazir, but for poor people who needed money to bring their own carbon for nazir. So that should go, if he has extra money, it should go to other people who are nazirim. And Moser Nazir, let's say the person has extra money for himself, for his personal carbon that he's bringing, because he himself is a Nazir, Linadava. Again, that's also going to be donated for karbanos that are put on the Mizbeach at times when the days are long and they need to fill the Mizbeach with karbanos. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Ad Nos Amon, means while I was still in Bavel, before I came up to Eretz Yisrael, Sham is called Rav Yehuda Sha'al Shmuel. I heard Rav Yehuda ask Shmuel the following question. Hifrish shiklov a mace. Let's say a person separates his machatzis hashekel and then he dies. So what do you do with the machatzis hashekel? Amar lei, so he said to him, Yiplu l'nedava. That falls to nedava. In other words, again, that's used as a donation to the Beis Hamikdash to buy carbon olos during the long days, so that the mizbeach should not be bottled, so that there should always be a carbon on the mizbeach. Now, what about Moser Asiris Ha'efa Shalo? Let's say a person, a Kohen Gadol rather, has designates some money for the Asiris Ha'efa. The Asiris Ha'efa was the carbon mincha that the Kohen Gadol brought every single day, and so now he's got extra money. What do you do with that extra money? Rabbi Yochanan says, Yolichem liyam hamelech. That money has to go to the Yam Hamelech. In other words, you can't get any benefit from it. Rabbi Elazar says, Yiplu l'nedava. That money, again, should fall to nedava, should fall to donations to the Beis HaMikdash for karbanos. So the Gemara now says, Masnisa pligal Rabbi Yochanan. Our Mishnah seems to disagree with Rabbi Yochanan. Again, Rabbi Yochanan saying that the extra money from the Asir Sa'efa goes to the Yam HaMelech. Our Mishnah seems to disagree. Our Mishnah says, Moser Shekalim Chulin. The extra from Machatzis HaShekel is Chulin. And Moser Asir Sa'efa seems to be the same Asir Sa'efa. Moser Kinei Zavim v'Kinei Zavos, Moser Kinei Yoldos, Chatos v'Ashamos, Moser Nedava. All of these things go to Nedava. That seems like the opinion of Rebbe Elazar. Does not seem to be the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, "My Avid la Rabbi Yochanan." What does Rabbi Yochanan do with this Mishnah? The Gra takes out this line of "My Avid la Rabbi Yochanan." But in any case, the Gemara says it's a question on Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara answers, Pasar lo, we can answer on behalf of Rabbi Yochanan as follows, Moser Asiris Ha'efa shel minchas chote shel kol Yisrael. We're not talking over here about Asiris Ha'efa of the Kohen Gadol. There's another carbon mincha that's brought, that's the Asiris Ha'efa. That is the carbon mincha, which is a carbon chatas of a regular Jew. This applies to particular carbon chatas, that if you're wealthy, you bring animals. If you're a little more poor, you bring birds. And if you're very poor, then you're going to bring this carbon mincha that we're talking about over here. So that is what our Mishnah is talking about when it says it's Mosran Nedava. But when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, it would actually be Liyam HaMelach. And we should just note that this Minchas Chote Shel Yisrael is brought particularly for two sins. It's brought for the sin of a Shua Sheker, a false oath, and also for the sin of entering the Beis HaMikdash Tameh. And again, that's what the Mishnah is referring to by the Moser Asiris Ha'efa. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yossi says, Al da alil Abba Barba. And the following thing, Abba Barba, that's also the father of Shmuel, that's Abba Barba, he argues on the following statement. The Inon Amen, because the Bnei Bavel said as follows. They said, Minayin Sha Pesach Mishtane L'Shem Shlomim. How do you know that if you take an animal and you designate it as a Korban Pesach, and it's not even the time for Korban Pesach, how do you know you bring it as a Shlomim? Talmud Lomar, because the Pasuk says, Vim min hatzon karbono lezevach Shlomim. It says if you bring a Shlomim from Tzon, and we darshan kol shehu min hatzon ba Shlomim, anything, any carbon, meaning a Korban Pesach, which is brought from Tzon, so if it can't be brought as a Korban Pesach, it's brought as a Korban Shlomim. So that's what the Bnei Bavel said. And Abba Barba argued against them, and he asked as follows. Hey Sivon, he asked the following question. Hare ola min hatzon. What about a Korban ola? That's also brought from Tzon. And we should say that if you have something that's designated, an animal designated for Korban ola, and can't be brought as a Korban ola, it should be brought as a Shlomim. But we don't say that. So they answer, Davar sheino ba ela min hatzon. No, the pasuk means specifically a carbon that is only brought from Tzon, like Korban Pesach. Yatzas ola, to exclude ola, shehu ba afilu min habakar. You can bring a Korban ola from Tzon, or you could bring it from bakar. You can bring it from cattle. Hey Sivon, so they asked another question. Hare Asham, what about Asham? Asham is only brought from Tzon. So if you have something that's designated as a Korban Asham, it should be brought instead as a Korban Shlomim if it can't be brought as an Asham. So Amar Ravi Bon Bar Kahana min hatzon. He says no, because the pasuk says from Tzon, meaning davar shuba mikol hatzon. It has to be a carbon that is brought from all kinds of tzon, meaning from kvasim and izim, from sheep and goats. Yatza asham, to exclude a carbon asham, she'eno ba element kvasim. Gra changes it to the word kvasim here. So an asham is only brought from kvasim, it's only brought from sheep, it's not brought from goats, min kvasim bilvad. Again, the asham is only brought from kvasim, so the rule doesn't apply to the carbon asham, it only applies to Korban Pesach. Again, Korban Pesach can be brought as a Shlomim in a situation where it can't be brought as a Korban Pesach. So then the Gemara asks as follows, B'chol asar at amar min lamait. In every other situation, the word min is an exclusion. So min hatzon should exclude something. V'kan at mar min larabos. And here you're saying that the word min is including, meaning it has to be from kol hatzon, it's to include all tzon, meaning kvasim and izim. Why is suddenly the word min an inclusion instead of an exclusion? So the Gemara answers, Amar Reb Menar, Reb Menar says, Hachanami here also min lamait. It really is an exclusion. What is it coming to exclude? Miut she'eno ba ben shtei shanim, miut she'eno ba nekeva. Because we're excluding the fact that you can't bring a Korban Pesach if it's 2 years old. You can't bring a Korban Pesach from an animal that's a female. In other words, it has to be a year-old animal, and it cannot be a female. It has to be a male. That's the exclusion. So again, the point is, we're referring to Korban Pesach, and we're saying that if it can't be brought, an animal that was designated as Korban Pesach can't be brought as a Korban Pesach, it's brought as a Shlomim. The next line over here, V'gabe Yoshim nami min lamayit hu she'eno ba'al min ha'elim bilvad, is taken out by the Gra. The Gemara continues, Hey Sivon, so they asked another question. V'aksiv, doesn't the pasuk say, V'im min hatzon karbono min hakavasim o min ha'izim la'ola? Talking about carbon ola, it says the same kind of language. If you're going to bring it from tzon, you bring a carbon ola. Me'ata moser ha'pesach ba'ola. Now, if you took that pasuk, you can look at that pasuk and say, the pasuk means, if you have a carbon that's normally brought from tzon, it should be brought as a carbon ola. So moser ha'pesach shouldn't go l'shlomim, it should go la'ola. If you have an animal designated for carbon pesach, can't be brought as a carbon pesach, should be an ola, not a shlomim. And to that, the Gemara answers very simply, we have a choice between an ola and shlomim. We're going to choose shlomim for the following reason. Amar Rabbi Avon says, Mishan and davar shula achila l'davar shula achila. You change from a carbon that's eaten to another carbon that's eaten. Ve'ein mishan and davar shula achila l'davar she'eno la'achila. You're not going to switch an animal from a carbon that's eaten, like carbon pesach, to a carbon ola, which is not even eaten. And similar answer, Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bon. Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bon says another reason why we go to carbon shlomim and not carbon ola. Mishanin kachim kalim l'shem kachim kalim. You switch an animal from kachim kalim, carbon pesach, to another kachim kalim, meaning shlomim, to the lighter forms of kachim. Vein mishanin kachim kalim l'shem kachay kachim. You're not going to switch an animal that was originally kachim kalim, that was originally a carbon pesach, and make it into kachay kachim, meaning a carbon ola. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yochanan says, Al do olul Rabbi Chanina. On the following opinion of the Bnei Bavel, Rabbi Chanina disagrees. Because the people of Bavel say, Eina Pesach mishtana l'shem shlamim. A korban Pesach is not brought as a shlamim, elim kein shachtu l'shem shlamim. Unless you shecht it as a shlamim. In other words, again, you designate an animal, let's say, not at the time of Pesach, as a korban Pesach, you can then bring it as a shlamim if you shecht it as a shlamim. But I say, afilu shachtu l'shem ola, even if you shecht it as an ola, so even in that situation, you can bring it as a shlamim. In other words, the first opinion says, if you shecht it as an ola, it's going to be totally puzzle. But he says, I say that it's even if you shecht it as an ola, it's going to be brought as a shlamim. Amar Rab Ila says, time with Rabbi Yochanan, the reason of Rabbi Yochanan that even if you shecht it as a korban ola, it's brought as a shlamim is as follows: Im min hatzon korban ola zevach shlamim. Again, the pasuk says, if you bring a shlamim from tzon, and we darshan kol shu zevach, anything that's a zevach, anything korban pesach bo shlamim is going to be brought as a shlamim, even if you have in mind at the time of shchita that it's a korban ola, it is brought as a shlamim. And so now the Gemara just said that if you have, again, an animal that was designated as a korban Pesach, but not at Pesach time, general halach is you bring that as a shlamim. And the Gemara has just said that if you have in mind at the time of shechita that it's an ola, you still bring it as a korban shlamim. But the Gemara now asks an interesting question. The Gemara asks, umishtane lemachsheves psul. Does this animal change in terms of the machsheves psul? That's going to be explained in a moment. Gemara explains, hey Chavida, what exactly is the case over here? What do you mean to say machsheves psul? Case is as follows. Shachta l'shem ola. You took this korban Pesach not at the time of Pesach, and you shechted it as an ola. Now it's really supposed to be brought as a shlamim, but you had in mind as an ola. But also al minas lizrok dam l'machar. You also had in mind that you're going to do the Zrikas Hadam the next day, meaning you had in mind a machshava of pigel, an intention to do the Zrika at the wrong time, which is called a machshava of pigel. So the Gemara wants to know, are there two psulim over here in this korban, or is it one? Do you have just the machshava of pigel, or do you also have the issue that a korban Pesach is not allowed to be brought shelo lishmo? Now there happens to be a halacha that korban Pesach cannot be brought as a different korban, but other korbanos, if you bring them not lishmo, it's still a kosher korban. It's not considered a psul. So the question over here is, is this thing considered a korban Pesach, which you now have pigel, because you had a machshava to do the zrika lamachar, and you have a machshava, another psul, of the fact that you had in mind at the time of shechita that it's a korban ola. Do you have two psul, or no? Do we say the idea that it's a korban Pesach is not true anymore? This item is not a korban Pesach, and you don't have that psul that it's shelo lishmo. So the Gemara asks, what difference does that make? Mikol makom pasul. Either way, you have a psul over here. Either it's pigel, or it's pigel and it's shelo lishmo. What difference does it make if it retains the shem korban Pesach to add on the psul of shelo lishmo, which applies to korban Pesach, or if it doesn't have that psul? Who cares? It's still pasul either way. So the Gemara says, no, it does make a difference. In teimar mishtane lemachsheves psul. If you say that it's mishtane as far as machsheves psul, meaning it's no longer considered a korban Pesach, this animal, and therefore there is no din, there is no psul of shelo lishmo, so then all you have is the machshava pigel, so then it's going to be called pigel. And the nafkamina is that if it's called pigel, you're going to be chayiv kares. Counterintuitively, if there's only a problem of pigel, it's actually worse, because then it's called pigel and you're chayiv kares. But in Tamar, but if you say ein mishtana lemachsheves psul, if you say that it is not going to be mishtana for machsheves psul, meaning it's going to be considered to be like a korban Pesach, then you're going to have two psul, then you're going to say pigel pasul. Then you're going to say it's not pigel, it's just going to be pasul. You are not going to have a chiyuv of kares in that case. So that's the question over here, whether it's mishtana lemachsheves psul or not. And the Gemara has no answer to this question of whether it is considered a pigel or whether it is just simply pasul in this particular situation. Again, when you shecht it l'shem ola and also have in mind lizrok damo l'machar. Gemara continues along the same lines, asking the following question. Let's say you have a korban Pesach, again, not at the time of korban Pesach, and you shecht it lishmo, v'shalo lishmo, b'shar yemos hashana. So it's shar yemos hashana, it's not the time of shechting a korban Pesach, and you start out, you shecht it as a korban Pesach, which you're not supposed to do. That would actually be pasul. You're not supposed to shecht an animal as a korban Pesach if it's not the time for the korban Pesach. But you start out shechting it as a korban Pesach, but then you conclude the shechita, and you have in mind that it should be lishlomim, shalo lishmo. So is that going to be kosher or not? Do we follow what you did at the end and say it's a kosher shlomim, or do we say it's a problem? So Rabbi Bon Bar Chia b'shem Shmuel bar Abba, Rabbi Bon Bar Chia says in the name of Shmuel bar Abba, Mikevon she'ein lo shem, nasu keshochto lishmo v'shalo lishmo b'shtika v'hu kasher. He says it's the same thing as, let's say you would have started shechting it without having anything in mind. You just shechted stam, b'shtika. So then in such a situation, generally speaking, if you shecht a korban that's designated as a korban Pesach b'shtika, your stam intention, your stam das, is a korban Pesach. But then if at the end you would decide, oh no, I want this to be a shlomim at the end of the shechita, that would actually be kosher. So he says it's the same thing over here. This is not the time of the Korban Pesach. So therefore, if you would start out thinking in mind Korban Pesach, and then at the end have in mind Korban Shlomim, it would not be a problem. It would be totally kosher. So Amar Lei, so he said to him, Imkeinu, if that's the case, Afilu shachto lishmo, let's say the entire time you shechted as a Korban Pesach for the whole shechita, but al menas lizrok damo shalo lishmo, but you have in mind that you'll do the zrika as a Korban Shlomim, shalo lishmo. So Yasa Mishah Rishona, that also should be good. That should be as if you did from the outset, Kishochto lishmo v'shalo lishmo b'shchita v'yei kosher. It should be no different than if you did it b'shtika, and then at the end you had in mind shalo lishmo, and that's kosher. So in other words, even if the entire shechita was lishmo, which is a problem, but as long as you had in mind for the zrika shalo lishmo, that should be enough. So the Gemara responds, Amar Rabbi Abba Mori, Ma nomer b'shtika kosher o nomer b'shtika pasul. And the Gra here has a slightly different gears at the end. The gears he has at the answer is Minolon b'shtika kosher, dilma b'shtika pasul. Meaning, how do you know if you would, let's say, you're getting the answer from shtika. If you would, let's say, do the entire shchita quietly with no das at all, the stam das would be that it's for Korban Pesach, and maybe that would not be kosher. Maybe that would be a problem. Even if the zrika is going to be shalo lishmo, maybe the fact that the entire shchita is lishmo, not at the time of Korban Pesach, is going to be a problem. So basically saying you can't compare when the entire shchita is lishmo and the zrika is not lishmo. You can't compare that to a situation where the beginning of the shchita is lishmo and the end of the shchita is shalo lishmo. You can't compare those two things. So again, if the beginning is lishmo, the end is shalo lishmo of the shchita, that's going to be okay. That's going to be similar to starting at b'shtika. But if the entire shchita is lishmo, it's going to be problematic. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Moser, Nazir, L'Nedava. Again, the extra money that a Nazir designates for his karbonos is going to go L'Nedava. Rav Chisda says, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph.